John Rood, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Hey, John. Thanks. Great to be here.
You were in the test prep business, and believe it or not, I've interviewed another guy in the test prep business. He was a former presidential candidate named Andrew Yang. Do you know Andrew?
No, so I don't know Andrew. I know certainly who he is, and I know his story well. And we really built the company that I ended up building. We really modeled it after what his company had done, kind of like a boutique, high-end model in a sort of in a different space in the test prep industry. But like, yeah, I mean, I saw what he did. He had a nice exit, and man, he's really made the best of it for sure.
He sure has. What a great story. So folks can listen to that, but we're here to talk about Next Step, which was your test prep business. Tell me what your unique take on this. Like, what was your unique take on the test prep? And for those folks who don't know, maybe you could describe what test prep is as an industry.
Yeah, totally. So the test prep world is helping students do better on standardized tests. So the prototypical example is, SAT or ACT. It's just the college admissions test. Help high school kids do better on those tests to get into better colleges. There's all sorts of niches in that space. So, any profession, lawyers, doctors, et cetera, have their own tests to get into their own profession. So there's a bunch of little niches in that space. And what we started out doing was we thought that we would be in the law school space, and we ended up in the medical school admission space. After about 3 or 4 years of kind of fiddling around, not really knowing what we were doing, ended up in the med space, which worked well for us.
The medical space. So these are young people who want to get into med school.
Yep, correct.
There are standardized tests to do that. What's the business model?
So there's a variety of business models in test prep, and it kind of starts from low price products all the way to high end products. So the kind of the lower end of the spectrum is things like books, printed materials, flashcards, online quizzes. The next level up is courses. So in my day, which is now a little bit different, students would actually go to a testing center or a center on campus or off campus and actually sit in class. Now, of course, all that's online. And then at the highest end, there's all sorts of individualized tutoring services, which we did a lot of. There's, multi-week boot camps to operate during the summer. So there's a range of offerings, and we at one point or another we did pretty much all of them.
Interesting. So you ran the gamut. If you could draw a pie chart, but kind of by the end, what are the big slices? One-on-one tutoring, online learning. Like how would you divvy up the pie?
Yeah, totally. So one-on-one tutoring was where we started. And everyone who works in test prep thinks that they can go start their own company, and lots of people try. And where everyone starts is individual tutoring, because it's pretty clear how to get started in that. So we actually built a pretty good niche in that. And by the end, we were probably 40% individual tutoring, and then 40% online content and resources, and then about 20% online courses.
What's the difference between content and resources and an online course?
So think of a course as you're going to go meet at a certain time with another group of people, whereas a resource would be, the example that worked in our company is we did practice tests. So you log on, you take a practice version of the test that we taught for, and that was a really successful product for us.
It's interesting because I'd be curious to know how you kept tutors, because in the world that we all now live in, where Zoom and like online whiteboards and all that stuff exists, I would imagine most tutors worth their salt would rather just bill out for their time directly than to go through a test prep company. Did you have trouble to kind of keep and retain tutors?
It's a really good question. And that's one of the problems that I stayed up at nights worrying about, and then turned out to not be a problem whatsoever. And we lost people over the years sometimes for exactly that reason, because you see, the company's billing me out for twice what I earn. And that's why people go start their own test prep companies. And like I'd said, but what we found was a couple of things. So number one was, obviously getting the students. So a large company with national reputation and natural reach that has professional marketing will get a lot more students than someone that is just like posting up, flyers around campus. Secondly, us being able to kind of be a layer of intermediary between the teacher, the teacher and the student, and often the parent, who's the kind of the fourth party there. I think that most of our instructors found that to be pretty valuable.
He's smiling as he describes the parent interface.
Yeah.
Why isn't my kid getting 1,400? You promised
Exactly.
me they get 1,400. It's like,
it's not easy.
You can lead a horse to water. Oh, I can only imagine. How did you guys finance this thing? I mean, did you own 100%? Did you raise money? Did you have partners? Like, what was that like?
This was bootstrapped. So I had spent 3 years at the beginning of my career in management consulting, and I think I earned $50,000, and I think I got a promotion to $60,000, and lived real cheap. And then by the end of those 3 years, I mean, it wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough to kind of pay our expenses for a little while as the company got going.
And then you kind of poured. Were you pouring profit back in to build up, or were you drawing a lot of cash out as you grew, or what was that like?
We were drawing a lot of cash, and I think that's probably, if I had to do it again, I would probably keep more money in the business, which I think is like atypical. Like, I think that most entrepreneurs probably overinvest in their business at the expense of kind of their own personal savings. But I don't know, like, I was always really frugal. I was really excited to be earning money. Like I said, I wasn't earning a ton of money before. So when I had the opportunity to earn like $100,000 a year, like, oh my God, like that's a huge amount of money. And then like, as it kind of ramps up, like that was really, that kept being the case. So I think we kind of underinvested in it. Probably could have been bigger than we made it by the end had I kept more of that money in there. But just like, who I am and was, the way that I was raised, like if there's an opportunity to put some money in the bank in a safe way, like that was really important to me.
And were you building to sell? I mean, were you planning an exit, or was this sort of like, a business you were planning to pass on to your kids, or what was your end game?
I think that we had always intended to sell it at some point. And
sorry,
I think when that's me and my wife, who actually worked together on the business. She ended up going to law school and having her own law firm and doing some other stuff, but we worked on it together in the beginning. And she was always a board member and a presence in the business. So I think the business was built to sell. It's funny. I don't think I ever considered for a second that my kids would want to run it. And in part because I started it when I was 26, we didn't have any kids, but I never really thought about that at all. I thought this was kind of the vehicle that I have to make money, to build wealth in my life. And that was what it was there for.
Got it. And what did you do? We were talking before we hit record about some of the moves you made to kind of jack up the value of the business, because a service business generally trades at a fairly modest multiple of earnings with a lot of the kind of cash tied to an earnout. Mm-hmm. But you did some things, maybe walk through what you did to build more value into the company.
Yeah, totally. So our story was we started doing individual tutoring in this education niche that we were in. And that market was a good market. I think we did really well there, but has a bunch of problems. One of them being the one that you had mentioned before, which is sometimes the tutors want to leave. And so there's a question of like, if you buy the business, what are you actually buying, right? Like if you're just buying a list of instructors and some marketing resources, that's worth something, but it's not worth, an attractive multiple. So as we kind of got the business to be more mature, we saw, we really need to get more into the content space. So we started writing books. We eventually published 8 print publications, which was a heck of a lot of work that did okay. And then we did a number of practice exams and practice resources online for our students and sold those separately. Those did very well. And in the education world, at least, I'm sure it's similar in other industries, but in education, kind of like the bottom value is services. The next value up is content, professional development for teachers, video lectures, et cetera. And then as you get higher, right, the next thing is, can you deliver that in a systemic way, oftentimes on a subscription basis with technology? So we started to think about, we've got these good resources. We need to start building out our technology that's going to be able to kind of bring those to students and make it look more like a subscription-based company, more as opposed to a, exchanging time for money type company.
And were you able to design a subscription model? I'm thinking an MCAT Like once you pass, you're kind of done.
Yeah.
How did you do a subscription model?
Yeah. So generically, in education, things are sold kind of in blocks of time. And that's basically what we did. And for exactly the reason that you said, right? So a student will say, hey, I'm taking this exam in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, whatever. You buy that block of time, then you have it. And then of course, one of the biggest problems in the test prep world is 100% of your students churn. And if your students don't churn, it's because something got messed up, right? If they have to take the test again, right? That's an even bigger problem. So that's one of the challenges. But being able to kind of make sure that you've got a products that kind of fit those blocks of time it was really critical.
And did you ever think about selling something to the universities themselves, the med schools that were trying to recruit students? Did you ever get any revenue from the schools themselves?
Not really. I mean, we poked around at that a little bit. It just wasn't a big market.
How big did you get this company in terms of whatever you're comfortable sharing, revenue or number of employees, before you decided to exit?
So it was high single digits millions of revenue. So I was between $5 and $10 million in revenue. And I think we had 21 full-time employees and about 150 instructors. Got
it. And profitable, like EBITDA margin's good. Can you give us a range of margin? Is what you put to the bottom line on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on the year, but we'd be somewhere between probably 20 and 40% on a given year. Wow. So that's a good business. It was really hard to get to that point, but when things kind of got humming, it went pretty well.
What was the hardest part?
I would say the hardest part is market differentiation in this space. So we're competing against really large companies that have been doing test prep for now 100 years. Kaplan is the number one name in test prep, and they've got a presence in every different market. So competing against the companies that really have all those advantages of longevity and just mind share of students is really hard. And it's kind of one of those markets, I think, where given that that's the case, like your product can't be 2% better or 5% better or 10% better. It's got to be 50% better. It's got to be like noticeably better in order to win. And
so your product presumably was better.
I think so. Yeah, that's my opinion. Yeah.
Well, better be if you're the founder. So what else did you do to differentiate the company beyond the product itself? I understand the product was better, but what else did you do to compete against Kaplan, which is this kind of 800-pound gorilla?
What I found was that the team that we ended up building by the end felt to me just like an all-star team. I mean, we had people that had been at Kaplan or at one of our other competitors for, in some cases, over a decade. That came to play on our team because they liked the culture, they liked the product, they liked what we were building. I think that a company at that stage, it's on a great growth trajectory, it has a great growth story, has a lot of advantages in recruiting for, really for those reasons. Like everyone wants to be a part of the winning team. And if we're able to show people that vision and say like, hey, we're building something big and exciting here, we're doing it with an all-star team, we tended to kind of like roll that boulder downhill as opposed to uphill for recruiting.
Well, with 20 employees and almost 10 million in revenue, you're basically $500,000 per employee, which is a pretty big number.
That's a big number, and we did have all of our instructors that got a cut of that too. So it gets distributed over more people. A lot of them are part time.
Oh, right, I forgot. You've got not only full time, but you've also got part time tutors and so forth. Did you have any sense of what it might be worth before you went to market? Had you kind of done any market sense of it's a 5 times EBITDA or 10 times EBITDA? Like, did you have any sense of what you thought the market was for a company like yours?
I had a little bit of an inkling, just because the space that we're in is really small, right? There's just not a lot of companies that kind of get to that, even a relatively modest size of being in the millions of dollars of revenue. So when a deal would get announced, like you kind of hear about it and kind of like, call your friends and see what these things might be worth. But I don't think I really had a really good idea. And certainly there was nothing that said like, we never got a valuation or anything like that said like, here's what we think it's worth before we started to get actual market signals.
Yeah. But when you looked around at other deals being done, you talked to friends, like what were people saying? What kind of ranges were you hearing?
We were hearing people that were selling for, we saw a lot that were kind of in the, like that kind of the services type bucket that were selling for 2 to 4 times earnings. Much larger than that, I think was pretty unusual until you got to like the really large companies who are, getting bought by Publix or getting bought by, already fairly large companies that were trading for much higher. Oftentimes with really big kind of like technology angles. Who were selling to clients like universities that you had mentioned in sort of like adjacent industries. So like things like student services, things like managing financial aid, in the education world, which were, education, but were significantly different businesses.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And so tell me about the exit. Like, was there something that triggered this or like what happened?
Yeah, I had been in that business for 8 years and it felt like a long time. I was still having fun with it. I think, as I mentioned, I love that team and everyone that was on it. We started to see that I think to kind of take the next step, it was going to take a big reinvestment. And it actually kind of goes to the question that you had asked about whether we took money out of the business or whether we reinvested. And I had felt to really get to the next step, we needed a big push on technology. We needed a big push on people. And the earnings that we had were needed to get plowed back into that business for several years. And then if something happened, there was a significant risk, at least in my mind, that we would be left with virtually zero, right? I mean, we had a quite profitable company. If we, plowed a bunch of money back into it and then one of 100 different things went wrong, and now we've got a company that is either, barely profitable or losing money or something, that's just not worth very much in our industry at all. So, like many entrepreneurs, it was just kind of time to de-risk it a little bit and get something off the table.
Yeah. And I'd be curious, like, was, a lot of times I hear like it's the birth of a child. I think there's something about having a kid where like that protector sort of gene or side of your personality kicks in and you're like, man, I've got to provide for this, this little human being that's totally defenseless. Was there any sort of life event that you could point to in your own life that triggered? Or
that's a good question. And it was, we sold in 18, really decided to sell in 17 at the end of 17. So my first son was born in 2015, my second son in 2017. So it was around that time. I do think that my hope was to be able to make sure that I was around for my kids growing up. And when we talk about kind of like what life is like now, like that's a big part of it. But I really didn't want to kind of miss out on that. I didn't want to have to be at work 80 hours a week during those first few years of my kids' lives.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So brand new kids, been 8 years. You think, maybe now's the time to de-risk a little. So what did you do next?
So we had started getting outreach from a number of buyers, which I think now like everyone gets outreach like every week from someone, but we had started to get a little bit of push from kind of the search fund crowd in, say 2016, 2017. And I had an advisor and board member who was in a kind of like a big time consulting organization, just kind of knew all the players in the Chicago area, went to Chicago booth for business school. So just knew everybody. He said one day, like, we should take you around and introduce you to some of the private equity guys. So he took me around, introduced me to a bunch of the private equity guys. We had a lot of nice conversations. And then, ultimately, this was a couple years later, we ended up selling to one of those people that we had met kind of during that tour that was putting together a roll up in that space.
And when you did those, so the kind of the tour a couple of years prior, like how would you for folks who are maybe thinking of doing something similar, some very kind of passive outreach, entertaining a couple of conversations, like what did you learn about those conversations? What was surprising, or what did you find? Again, this is a couple of years before they got serious.
Yeah.
So how would you characterize those conversations?
Well, first of all, they weren't particularly hard to get because I think that folks in the investment space, in the private equity space, in the M&A space, always want to learn. So when you set one of those meetings, they come with a list of questions because they want to learn about your business. And part of that is to your benefit, right? Because you want to kind of be spreading the word about what you're doing. Hey, this is a great company and we're growing, et cetera. But at the same time, like they want to know who are your competitors, how big are your competitors. This is a good space generally. So if you're kind of hitting the right type of firm or the right strategic buyer that's interested in your space, they really want to know. They want to know all about it. On the flip side, I think we learned a ton. Number one, I don't think I knew how private equity worked. I don't think I knew how strategic acquisitions really worked. And I could have learned in a better way. Like I could have picked up a book, and I don't know why I didn't, but I just didn't. So I think learning how that process works a little bit was beneficial. I think the other part of it was, we had one meeting with a really big firm, not the people that ended up buying us, but we went in there and they were like, "How big is your company?" And so I told them. They're like, "Okay, that's too small." And that was like a 10-minute meeting. But what's beneficial about that was to kind of learn, like, what are the yardsticks where you can really be a successful acquisition for different sizes of companies, right? So if you've got a company with $500,000 in earnings, there's a search fund type person out there, who would love to buy your company, I'm sure. But, if you really want to get into institutional capital, be bought by a significant firm, you've got to be thinking about getting into kind of millions of dollars of earnings. And so that lets you think about, where are we now? Where do we have to kind of get to before this is a realistic option?
Got it. And I would point my listeners to a couple of episodes we've done in the past. Steve Davidikos, we had a couple of weeks ago, who talked about the search fund that John is referring to now. So check that episode out. Adam Coffey talked about the private equity playbook. So talks a lot about the sort of tranches of size. So a couple of resources for my listeners to check out to go deeper where you're referring. But this makes a ton of sense. So you have these conversations. How did you handle direct questions like, what's your profit? What's your revenue? What makes you unique? I mean, were you totally an open book? Did you hold some stuff back?
That's a good question. And it's funny. It feels so long ago. I'm trying to remember these conversations exactly. My perspective is generally to be honest with people. I think probably, would say a range, like, what's your revenue? I'd say, between X and Y. Why did I do that? I don't know. Like, it probably feels like you're not supposed to tell people who are more sophisticated investors than you, like, all of your information. But eventually it's going to come to light. And so I feel generally like it's better for people to be honest. And, putting myself back in those shoes, like when I learned, like, what's the exact revenue of one of my competitors, like, what do I do with that information? That doesn't help me compete against them more efficiently. It's just like kind of like a nice to know. So I think I was pretty honest, and probably would be even more honest in the future.
Got it. Okay. So phase one, you have these kind of very polite, very nice, superficial meetings around town with private equity groups. Where does it go from there?
So then nothing happened for a while. So we went and built our business. And then, one day one of those folks called up and said, hey, we're putting together a roll up in this space and looking at another company that we would want to put you with. Do you want to talk about it? So we had those conversations, and those went well. And, that process just went forward over the course of a couple months. And then ultimately, it came time for us to decide, and we decided. And I think it was a good group of investors. We're still engaged with them now. I'm still on the board over there. It's good folks working on the roll up in the other business. So it felt like a good fit. It felt like a group that could kind of meet that goal that I had for the business of reinvesting in the technology. So that I think was part of it, and that ultimately I think did come to pass and what happened with the company. And so those were kind of our drivers.
Got it. What was your reaction to their? I'm assuming at some point they provided you with an LOI, a letter of intent, which was like the document before the share purchase agreement, but the sort of informal. What was your reaction to that?
I thought it was amazing. I thought we had started to get an idea of kind of what the valuation should have been like, and I think it's hard because, especially as a first-time entrepreneur, as someone who didn't come from a wealthy family, who didn't have a lot of personal savings or wealth, seeing what the number is, like, there's kind of two senses of it, right? So one sense is, oh my God, this is a huge amount of money and it's going to change my life. And there's the second sense of it, which is like, wait a second. I'm like a very sophisticated business person. We're going to have to negotiate this and like really ratchet it up. But it's like on one side, you're like, well, this is not enough money. And that's like the public face. And like the private face is like, like Scrooge McDuck, like bathing in money, right? And it's kind of like managing those two sides of your personality, or at least my personality, in that process.
Did you pull it off? I mean, did you kind of fold your arms and they first sent it and said this isn't enough? Like, what was your physical reaction?
I think I did. I think I did okay with it. I think we got to where everyone was happy with it. And yeah, I think it was good.
Yeah. Got it. And did you go to market? I mean, you went to a few firms 2 years prior. Did you sort of feel out if there were others that might be interested, or?
Yeah, we did. So we hired a banker who would kind of run like a closed process for us, I think you would say, where he just went out to like a short list of maybe a dozen folks and saw who else was interested. And we got some other valuations from some other groups, including a strategic. And those were all fine, but I think that the original offer was pretty close to where we had needed to be.
Yeah. And I know we have to be careful about what the actual numbers were, and I totally respect that. And you can just tell me to go to hell if you want. But I'd be curious, when you first started to kind of hear about other deals, you'd sort of heard 2 to 4 times EBITDA, a heavy service base was sort of, I'm going to read between the lines and say, it may have exceeded that if you were kind of eye-popping and thinking, this is awesome. Your impression of the number was probably like, hey, this is better than what I've heard the market will bear. Confirm or deny? Or
yeah, I think that's relatively true. I think that we were successful at a business in escaping kind of the service business trap.
Yeah. And how did you structure the deal? Most of these private equity deals, and again, I'd encourage our listeners to go check out Adam Coffey if folks are listening, but there's usually sort of an equity role that they ask the founder to make. Did yours structure it that way, where there was a kind of a majority recapitalization, but then there was an equity role?
Yeah, that's correct. That's what we did.
Got it. And then what about operating the business post sale? Did they ask you to stay on and sort of run it, or what was that like?
Yeah, so we stayed on. Everyone on the management team, I think, was supposed to stay. I personally ended up as COO of the combined business, and I stayed there for 2 years operating that business.
Who was the CEO?
The founder of the other company that they put us with.
Ooh, that's okay. So that's got to be interesting dynamics. I mean, 2 entrepreneurs. That can be very challenging. What was that like to have another entrepreneur who had probably a very similar background sort of be your boss?
I have nothing but good things to say about everyone involved. And I will say from my own, because ultimately, what do we control? We don't control our environment. We don't control, what other people do. We control our own actions and our own responses to things. I think it was very difficult for me. And looking back at that, and again, like I don't think anyone did anything wrong, like really including me. But I think for your reaction is exactly right. You're like, oh my God, that's a hard reaction. Yeah, it's hard. And I think that, for me, and I believe for a lot of entrepreneurs, but speaking for me, like, I got into this because I didn't really want to have a boss. Like when I was, I worked in consulting for 3 years. I thought my bosses there were great too, but didn't really love having one. And so I think that, selling and kind of moving into a position where you're not in charge, is hard. But I think like whatever your title or position in the business is, it always changes when you sell it. Like you're not the majority owner. So if you're the CEO or you get bumped down to marketing associate, it kind of doesn't matter because the CEO still reports to the investors, reports to the board, et cetera. So I think that just the process of going from closely held, majority owner of a business to not is a big adjustment for sure.
Yeah, because not only is it you're used to being in complete control, you bootstrapped it, you're the final decision maker on everything. Now you've got this sort of boss. But what I find fascinating is not only do you have a boss, but a chunk of your wealth is in this company that you're relying on your boss to execute effectively. And there must be times along the way where you disagree and you're like, I disagree. And not only am I pissed off at my boss, but this huge chunk of money is at risk. That must be brutal.
Yeah, I think that is both hard and common for folks that sell. I think speaking for myself, I think it's exactly right. Like there's a significant amount that you roll over in a deal like this, and you feel pretty, forcefully that you want that to do well. And having multiple kind of strong viewed, successful people having different opinions causes conflict. And then the question is like, what do you do with that conflict? How do you manage it? Those are the questions. Yeah. And now looking back at that in hindsight, like I probably could have managed some of that better for myself, again, with my own actions, my own reactions, my own emotions. But I think it's generically a challenging time.
Yeah, for sure. No question. And we've heard that from others. How did you structure, like, was there a straw that broke the camel's back that you decided to leave, or was it a period of time? Like how and when did you decide to leave an operating role?
Yeah. So I left after about 2 years. There was no structure to it that dictated that. It just felt like it was time to move on. Like I at that point I'd been with this business for 10 years. It was changing. I didn't think that my skill set was as necessary as it had been before. And there was just other things that I wanted to do with my time and with my life. We're kind of foreshadowing to the other part of our conversation here a little bit, but like, I'm not sure what those, I don't think I'd thought hard enough about what those things were going to be, but I knew for sure that, this is a business I started when I was, 26 or 27. I didn't want to be doing it when I was 67. And the time was just right.
Yeah. And so you remain on as a board member and significant shareholder of
Correct.
The company. And that's helpful. And I've never had that role. So this is somewhat for my own edification, but you now would vote on key decisions, you'd vote on a budget, and presumably, and you would have sort of one vote, and there'd be other board members that could outweigh you, presumably from the private equity group. If there was a contentious decision, you would have sort of one vote, but there would be others that would sort of drown you out if everybody kind of lined up against you on a certain vote. Is that how that works?
Yeah, what you said from a sort of a technical legal standpoint, what you said is absolutely correct. What I've observed on the board that I'm on, as well as a bunch of the other advisory and board roles that I've been on for other companies, is no one wants those things to come down to a vote. So, when you read in the news about like, Sam Altman gets fired from OpenAI and the vote was 3-2 or whatever, like that's not how these kinds of things operate. Because to your point, the majority investor has infinity votes, right? If it comes down to it, someone has infinity votes and you have like one, right? So no one wants it to get to that point. So you're there to advise, you're there to instruct, you're there to kind of impart whatever sort of experiences you can from running your company in ancient history, plus whatever you're doing now. And it's, I think, ideally a very advisory and collaborative process, and not a 3 votes to 2 type process.
Yeah. That's really helpful for me, and having never kind of done that before. It's interesting, and it does provide a kind of a closure point for our conversation about your exit. But as you alluded to, there's a second part of our conversation that I wanted to have, because you've just done an amazing piece of research with 71 exited founders, and you're working some of that research into a book. So maybe let's talk about the book. It's called Beyond the Exit. What inspired you to kind of want to write it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So it's a couple of things. The selfish reason was I always wanted to write a book. Since I've been little, like that's a goal of mine, to have a piece of work that, I don't fool myself that people will be reading this in 500 years, but that, that will exist after I'm done. It's a thing I knew a lot about, and it's a process where this kind of post-exit time, like the time for myself after I sold and after I left the operating company, I just didn't think hard enough about what I wanted to do with that time or how I wanted it to work. And it was just a really kind of lost in the woods time for me. Like I had depression from that time. I didn't know what I should work on. I was like, I tried to do one thing and then like hate that and quit, and try to do another thing and hate that and quit. And it just wasn't a good time for me. And I don't know why I hadn't done this before, but I started then ask, entrepreneurs who were kind of like ahead of me on the journey, like, wait a second, like if you sold a business 10 years ago, 20 years ago, what was that time like? They're like, oh, and they described all those things, right? So I realized that it's not that I was just like, that I was doing it wrong. I can do it, but I could have done it better, but I wasn't doing it wrong. It's just a life stage, right? But it's a life stage that no one talks about, right? For a couple of reasons. Number one, not many people like have gone through it. So it's like the people that have been on your podcast, and that's sort of that's kind of it, right? There's a couple thousand people that sell a significant business every year. And so that's a small group. And people also just like, honestly, like don't like hearing about the problems of rich whiners, which is a quote that I heard from in one of my interviews. Right. And I try to be explicit about that. Like the problems that I have, like, what do I want to do with my life? Like that's extremely important to me. Like in the context of like war in the Middle East and, starving children and political turmoil and whatever, like my problems don't matter. Like I'm fine. My kids are fine. Like my life is great. But that said, it's an important part of people's lives. And I would love for people to kind of go through it, kind of knowing better what to expect and hopefully handling it ultimately better than I did.
And to be clear, when you're describing this period of sense of loss and being a little bit lost in the woods, I think is the expression you used. This is after you have stepped down as chief operating officer of the combined businesses. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So you've gone through an exit. You did a majority recapitalization. You're COO. And this is when you've left. So you've got time on your hands now, which is the big factor, the X factor, where you've got time to contemplate and you felt fairly lost. Yeah. What was it like with your wife? You mentioned your wife and she's building a law firm. I found sometimes it can be really hard on a spousal relationship, like a married couple.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious for you, if you're willing to share what that was like for your relationship with your wife.
Yeah, I think it was a hard transition. I think that people sometimes say, I'm not sure if I agree with this, but people say that the definition of stress is change. And there's a lot of change when you sell a business. And go from, doing one thing to not knowing what you are going to do, from, oftentimes going to an office every day for 10 hours to like piddling around the house at 3 p.m. like all day. And I think that's a period of change. I think that, for us, there had been a lot of focus on this business, right? And for whatever that's worth, the focus in an entrepreneurial family is oftentimes on the business, right? Sometimes at the expense of other things that are going on. And so, I think for us, it was figuring out how to move that focus away from the business, which no longer exists, but like we don't have any control of it, to kind of like the rest of life. And, saying that, as I worked through all these interviews and started crafting them into this book, that was surprisingly common. And, we heard a lot of people who would go through hard times in their marriage. Oftentimes people would get divorced during this period. And it was such a surprise. And it's one of those things like, why am I writing the book? I want to inform people of that, right? Because sometimes I think, if I look back 10 years in my own life and say, wait a second, what if I sell my business for a huge amount of money? Like, won't that be incredible? Like, well, then like my life will be perfect. I interviewed a guy who I always use this quote. He's an amazing guy. And he said, my life after exiting my business was 10 out of 10, but I thought it would be 14 out of 10. And when you think about, your relationships, like you think, okay, it's going to be like this golden period and we're going to like go on all these Caribbean vacations or whatever. And then the reality is like, it's a change that has to kind of be worked through the system, not only of the individual, but of the family.
That's really interesting. What else? I'd be curious to know what other themes came out of these 71 interviews. Like I know you've written a whole book about it. So I'd be curious to know 2 or 3 that really popped for you.
Yeah. So one of them, and the biggest piece of advice I think that comes out of the work is that people need to be thinking about what they want to do after they leave their business, before they leave their business. And I was just terrible at this. Like I don't know. I have no excuse for why. I never really sat down and said like, here's what I want the next 5 years or 10 years to be like. And you and I had talked about, I've been a member of EO and, so have you. And we do like all sorts of like life planning and goal setting and everything in place like EO. I just didn't do that, right? I just didn't sit down and say like, here's what I want to do after I leave this business. And the people that had an easier transition out of their business had something that they were exiting to. And it couldn't just be golf, right? It couldn't just be like, I'm going to work less and like watch more movies. It had to be like a thing that was going to like take their energies, their creativity, like their drive and point it in a different direction. And, the people like me that hadn't thought about that weren't as successful. So I think that was one really, really big theme. I think a second is that this period lasts longer than a lot of people think. And I think that there's a period of mourning which can be delayed but not avoided. And what I mean by that is some of the people I interviewed would exit the business. I interviewed one guy who sold his business. He was very public with his numbers it's like $780 million, right? Wow. And he had partners, investors, but like he was set for life. But he was like, hey, I was an immigrant. I've experienced like poverty. I've experienced homelessness, et cetera. And it's just not in my DNA to chill. So we like started another business like the week after he got out of the first one. And what I learned was that people that do that generally end up hating the new thing that they get into. They want to, and they like feel trapped. They want to get out of that because they got in it for the wrong reasons. They got in it because like they have to kind of keep paddling. And the people that were more successful said, wait a second, like this is a time of grieving. This is a time of transition. I'm going to step back. And I'm going to do a process of kind of working through this time before I jump into something else.
Did you ever ask as part of your interviews, would they do it again?
Start a company?
Yeah. No, sell a company.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a really good question. I had a couple of people that had very specific reasons for regretting selling. And I think part of it is that grieving process. Everyone needs to work out their regret about something that happened in their deal, right? So what could it be, right? So I interviewed one guy who was like, well, the guys that bought my company screwed me in like XYZ way. I've got other people that said they bought my company, then fired all my good people. And I think about that every night, right? I heard that actually multiple times. One of them, which it's funny, I didn't hear this as much because assets have been priced so high. Like almost no one regretted selling for the amount they were like. Almost no one in this group was like, "Oh my God, my life would have been better had I only had $500,000 more." Right? Like no one thinks about that at that level anymore. But yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting kind of lines of thought is the people that had inherited the business that they ran. It was a family business, and I remember one guy who said. He's really honest about this. He was like, my dad gave me a thing and I don't have that thing to give to my children. And I was like, well, but you can give them like the money that you got for it. And that's pretty good. It's like, nope. Like this thing was like he saw it like a watch you get from your grandfather, right? Like I was given a thing. It's a family heirloom and I sold it for money. Like I just like took my watch to the pawn shop almost. And that really like those things I think can hit really hard.
Wow. Yeah. I hadn't even thought of that, but you're right. You were given a family heirloom and you think about the watch is a perfect analogy, right? You get this Philip Patek beautiful watch that was your grandfather to pass it down. Then you're like, I'm selling it for the highest bidder. Like you can feel kind of like a money grubbing, soulless, I'm not suggesting that's what that individual is or was, but I'm certain those feelings at times pop up.
It's a thing to work through.
Yeah. It does sound like a grieving process as you described, for sure. What about, did you hear anything around personal finances? So, common questions like, what'd you do with the money? Or, like, did you hear anything around lessons learned around what to do with all this money once you accumulate it?
Yeah, we talked a ton about that. And there's a ton about that in the book. One of the first things that people learn, and it's one of those things like, I'm going to say it to you, you'll be like, well, that's obvious. And like, you're 10,000 people in the audience to go listen to that. But well, that's obvious. Like money doesn't make people happy. Like money solves money problems. But most people don't. Most people understand that intellectually, but don't internalize that emotionally until they get to that point. The reasons that we're driven as entrepreneurs, and we're driven for different reasons, right? But like for me, it was really important to have security, right? Like I grew up. I was not poor growing up. Like we were middle class. Like we didn't have all the extra stuff. It turns out all the extra stuff doesn't matter, right? It turns out that stuff didn't make me happy. And a lot of people go through that. And one really interesting phenomenon I saw in the book is that for a lot of people, the higher the number, the harder it was to learn that lesson. It was for this reason. So if you're like, I'm a car guy, right? So think about for us car guys, like you sell your business, you're like, well, I'm going to buy myself a BMW M3. Okay, so you go buy your BMW M3, you drive around for 6 months. Like, well, that didn't really make me happy. Like, I needed to buy a Porsche 911. So you go buy a Porsche 911, that doesn't make you happy. You're like, wait a second, like I need to buy a Lamborghini or whatever, Ferrari or whatever, and you get that, and then that doesn't make you happy. Like, holy shit, like fancy cars don't make me happy. Whereas, the people that had a more modest exit, right? Like they get their M3, like, well, this is it. It doesn't make me happy. Like now I have to stop. Right. So I think learning those lessons and understanding that things that you buy generally don't make people happy in a sustainable way is kind of obvious, but also needs to be deeply felt. So that's one. I mean, we could talk about investments too, but that's one aspect of it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is the secret to happiness after an exit is one, take time to let the process unfold before jumping into something else. Number two, we refer to them as pull factors. I think you refer to them as things you want to go to, but effectively have a life scripted that you want to lead after your exit, more than golf, something that you're excited and passionate about. Don't go blow it all on fancy cars because it won't make you happy.
You can try it. It just won't work.
Yeah. Are there any other sort of secrets to, did you learn anything about people who had their surname in the business? So one of the things that, and this comes down to kind of family businesses, but oftentimes if their family name is in the business, like if it was Rood Test Prep.
Rood Inc. Yeah.
And you no longer control it. You've got the CEO of the other company who's running it day to day, making decisions that maybe you wouldn't do the same way. Like it can be hard for founders to see their name in lights on the side of the truck and know that they don't control it anymore. Did you hear any of that sentiment among the group that you talked to?
I don't think I talked to anyone whose name was in the company, but I talked to a lot of people whose lives were really closely intertwined in their company. So for example, I talked to a guy who ran a fairly large company, and all of his family was in it, and like his neighbors was in it. And he said to me, at one point I looked out my window, and I live in a cul-de-sac, and more than half of the houses in my cul-de-sac were like employees of my company. And so then he sells it, right? And like, it was really interesting because he went really far out of his way in his sales process to like really guarantee like a bunch of stuff for his employees, right? Like you can only fire this person for cause. And if you do, here's what the severance has to be, et cetera. So for some people, I don't know, it was their name, but it was like definitely like their reputation and their feeling that they were providing for certain people. And they wanted to protect that.
I found that to be very generational. Like I do find there's an older generation of entrepreneur, probably now in their late 60s, early 70s, who have this very patriarchal view, like I've got to protect my employees. I don't see the same from the 30 and 40 something entrepreneurs. Maybe it's a generational thing, but I don't know if you've seen anything around that. But
from my own experience, that was the thing that I thought a lot about it. And whenever you sell a business, like there's just transition in businesses, right? Like some people leave, some people go. Like if you don't sell a business, like there's still some people leave, some people go.
Sure.
And, I think I thought a lot about that, but ultimately the people that, help entrepreneurs build a business, like your best people, like they're going to find good jobs. Like they're probably going to find better jobs than the one that you gave them because you were able to, convince them to work under market, or you were able to help them build their skills to the next level. And now they can get to the next level of compensation. So like, I think that we're all worried, like, oh, we're going to sell this business, and then like our people end up on the street like destitute. Like, no, I mean, like they're going to keep going with their lives, right? You're not actually that important in their lives. They're going to go on to the next thing, and it's probably going to be better.
Well, let's leave it there. The book is called Beyond the Exit. It's not out yet, but I think you can opt in on your website to get a notification when it goes live. Just walk through that process.
Yeah. So the website is beyondtheexitbook.com. I've got a newsletter there. I send out periodically stories from the book, updates as to how we're making progress on it. And ultimately, I want to end up sending out at least a story every couple of weeks about an exited entrepreneur. Because there turns out to be more of us than I thought, and it's great to connect with those people. Great to hear those stories. Great to see what they're doing now. And then our book is hopefully will come out this fall.
Awesome. So it's Beyond the Exit book.com.
Yeah.
Drop your email and you'll get updates on the progress. John Rood, thanks for doing this.
John, it was a pleasure. Thank you.